Okay, morning again. When Johnny first asked me to talk at this conference, I initially said I'm not sure quite where my work fits, so bear that in mind. I do think there are some connections though. Some of the stuff that we talked about yesterday around ways of seeing, ways of looking, visibility, invisibility, but particularly notions of kind of mobility and sort of circulation of images. This particular paper I'm going to give is dealing with a historical collection, but the circulation of the images, the international circulation of the images, is quite important to thinking about, or my thinking about this particular work. The project, the stuff I'm talking about comes out of a larger project, of which I've produced a book, but the book's not quite the end point of the project. I'm still working on various things, some of which I'll sort of touch on in this paper. So the paper develops from research on what is a relatively unknown collection, has been a relatively unknown collection of photographs made in and around Cape Town, South Africa, between the late 1940s and 1952 by a photographer called Brian Heseltine. When I first came across him and this work, I asked most of the South African photographers and curators and researchers that I knew, and the name garnered no recognition there. I asked a few people in the UK, and it didn't really get much recognition there either, although he did in fact have a later career as a press photographer in the UK. But I'm focusing on a very particular period of about 3 or 4 years of his work. So I was fortunate enough to come across the collection in 2009, completely by chance I should say, and have spent the last 3 or 4 years doing research on it, and as I said, produced a book. However, whilst this sort of, given that it's relatively obscure, I will briefly contextualise the work, give you some idea of who this person was. My main task in the paper is not really a historical one. Rather, what I want to offer is some reflections on the dilemmas that are attendant on thinking about and working with this collection in the present. In ways I hadn't anticipated at the outset, I've found myself positioned not only as a researcher, a position I'm comfortable with, but as a curator, and a curator in the sense of one who cares for. That means sort of literally, I found myself becoming a sort of unofficial custodian of the collection and responsible and implicated to some degree in securing its long-term future, something haven't been so familiar with. As well as a curator in the sense of shaping the selection of the work for wider presentation to contemporary audiences, both in book and exhibition form. So in working with the collection, I've begun to think about how what I'm trying to do with these images relates to the intentions of the photographer, the intentions of others who have appropriated the work, and explore some of the issues involved in that. Furthermore, and perhaps more importantly, my ambition is to take the work back to South Africa in some form, where I hope a substantial part of the collection may eventually be deposited, and that's still an ongoing discussion. This has brought to fore questions of agency, how my agency as a researcher stroke curator interacts with the other multiple forms of agency which I suggest are enfolded within the collection, and in turn poses questions of ethical responsibility to the photographs, to the photographer, and to the subjects in the photographs, and perhaps, using this term in scare quotes, the communities from which the photographs come. I think it's useful to give some sense of who the photographer was and what this body of work represents, and of course I will show you some pictures, which is quite important. Heseltine, this is Heseltine, self-portrait from around the time he was taking these images. Was born in 1923, so he'd made all of this work that I'm talking about before he was 30, so it was sort of mid to late 20s. His father came from a relatively wealthy family of stockbrokers. They'd arrived in South Africa to set up a fruit farm in the Eastern Cape not long before Brian was born. He spent his early years in Cape Town, but was educated in England. For those of you for whom this reference might be meaningful, he was educated at Dartington Hall School. I don't really have time to go into that, but that does have a particular sort of cultural reference at that point in the 30s. In 1940, he returned to South Africa, and that's when he began his photographic career. He didn't train as a photographer in a kind of educational setting. He learnt his photographic practice in a studio with a studio photographer in Cape Town. He also had a paternal aunt who was was a sort of enthusiastic amateur, so he learnt from her too. And I have a little bit of her work, which I'm beginning to do a bit of research on. By the late 1940s, he'd established his own business and was producing photographic portraits of primarily white middle-class Cape-Townians, among them the artistic and theatrical circles in which he moved in Cape Town. He was clearly a very good portrait photographer. He had some success in Cape Town's amateur photographic scene. He had held exhibitions of work made with the Leica. Most of the work I'm talking about is made on medium and large format, but he did some work with small format and had an exhibition called With the Leica, both in 1945 and then under the same title but a different set of work in 1948. He also had a little bit of international success, and I'm not quite sure how the connection was made, but I suspect it's through some of his connections in the UK, through some of the people at Dartington, which saw a lot of international artists and practitioners moving through, coming from Europe and so on. Had some international success, and so 4 of his images were shown in Edward Steichen's post-war European photography exhibition, which is the precursor to the Family of Man for those who are kind of interested in the photographic history dimension. One reviewer, writing about his work in Cape Town, describes his work as remarkable for its bold harshness and cleanness, its swift perception, and its powerful compositions. He was, in a sense, one of a number of people bringing a kind of a sort of 30s, 40s European view of photography to South Africa, which in photographic terms might have been described as sort of rather backward at that point. I'll leave that there, I suppose. But at some point in the late 1940s, however, he began to turn his camera to the urban black and coloured, in South African meaning of that term, areas of the city. First wandering through the racially mixed areas of District 6 and what was then called the Malay Quarter, which is now the Borkap, for those of you that know Cape Town. These are some of the 35mm images he made there. Then, more unusually, he headed out into the black African townships and informal settlements on the outskirts of the city, in particular a place called Windermere. Sorry, this is the Borkap. This is Windermere. And I should say, I mean, I think you have to think yourself back to this period, because it seems, in a way, rather obvious that someone might take a camera and photograph in these areas. Well, actually, this is the point at which people in South Africa, white people with cameras, begin to start looking at urban blacks. If you go back previous to this period, images of black people were essentially, most of which would have sat under the heading of native studies, would have positioned black South Africans as based in rural areas. Ethnic identity would have been a sort of key issue within that. So this is really an emerging practice of looking at black South Africans, and that's one of the things I've been trying to look at through the research, both in archives and also in thinking about the images. So it's not straightforward that he happened to go to this place. This is not typical. This was not at that point on the kind of general itinerary of photographers. At this point in its history, Windermere was regarded as a dangerous slum and would soon be swept away in the tide of apartheid forced removals and racial zoning that followed the election of the racist National Party in 1948. Just to give you an idea, you can't see this very well, but this is a map of Cape Town from the period in which he photographed, and probably the kind of it shows almost all of the places he photographed, but I suppose the key point, this is actually a wonderful object, as well as this is only a portion of a huge map on a kind of material, which is the kind of markings you see in the middle. This has actually been annotated. This is a map of the city where people have actually gone out and surveyed blocks of housing, and the kind of the writing in pen on there says, you know, white, mixed, black, coloured, you know. So there's a whole kind of, this is sort of prior to the apartheid period, mapping out the kind of the difference within the city, which would of course be wiped, swept away, and the whole blocks of whole areas would then become only for coloured, only for black. Just to give you some idea of sort of where in the city, this is the Borkap, one area that survives to this day, pretty much intact from that period, and there are certain reasons for that which I don't have time to go into. This is really the centre of the city. This is District 6, which gets wiped away in the 60s. Windermere is up here, and this is a design. This is Langa, which is a Black African township, specially designed Black African township. And then the only other place he photographed in his collection goes off the map somewhere down here and is not quite built at the point this map was made. The key thing is, of course, that black people are being moved further and further from the centre of the city by a series of stages from the early part of the 20th century through to the apartheid period. And there's a continuity in that. There's 48 the coming to power of the apartheid government is an important point, but it doesn't necessarily break that continuity of movement from the centre of the city to the periphery. So let's just give you a little bit of sort of context in terms of space. This is an aerial photograph of Windermere, and you probably can't see that well from here, but it's a very sandy, flat, low-lying area, prone to flooding. What you saw, the kind of lake you saw in that first image, was a sort of area that would regularly flood. And very briefly, this is Windermere now. Then and now. These are photographs I made a couple of years ago, because the area which was on the periphery of the city, a very mixed, vibrant, sort of slightly loaded word, but anyway, area of the city was swept away, replaced by a coloured-only, what was intended to be a model township. So it's the work made in these areas that's of most interest to me at this point. Though I might also note that the photographer's agency has very clearly shaped the archive handed down to us. Because as the family story goes, when Brian and his wife left Cape Town by sea in 1952 to return and settle for good in England, he threw the bulk of his negatives overboard, keeping just the township photographs and a relatively small collection of other work, mostly portraits which I think had a personal value, though I haven't properly documented that part of the collection. So in a sense, this is his valuing of this particular body of work as well as my valuing of it. At the point in which he began photographing in Windermere, as I've said, Heseltine's photography intersects with, though I don't think can be reduced to, emerging ways of thinking about and significantly practices of looking at urban black Africans and the areas in which they lived, which, to compress a somewhat more complex discussion, can be thought to express a certain kind of liberal paternalism. The first part of my title, The Strange Places, is drawn from a letter in the family archive, which condenses a number of aspects of the relationship more socially minded white South Africans had to such places. And I'll just briefly quote that to give us some sort of flavour. We've been doing a study on the cost of living in squatters' camps, going out daily and visiting each family for about an hour a day, 7 days running, to get exact records of expenditure, diets, etc. I used to come home feeling as if I'd collected every possible infection, but seemed miraculously to have escaped. I often thought of Brian when we were at these strange places. That combination of documentation, sense of kind of danger of the township and danger and disease, but also a kind of curiosity, I suppose, all kind of bound up in a sort of complex way of looking. However, whilst liberally minded social welfare provided the context in which Heseltine entered the township, the argument I want to develop about how we might locate the work in the present turns on the idea that the specific visual agenda he pursued once there was not prescribed entirely by a liberal paternalist gaze, and that his way of seeing has the capacity to connect with the present. I suggest there is a strong aesthetic desire that animates Heseltine's photography, overriding a social vision of the township, a restless search for the visually interesting, focused on his subjects as makers of their environment, and that kind of, I speculate in the book about how that way of thinking might relate to his experience of being educated at Dartington. So makers of their environment, and by extension themselves. Sorry, going too fast. The photographs document the close craft skills of watch repair and bangle manufacture. That's what you can see there. The brewing of beer and the art of open-air butchery. I think it very much is the art of open-air butchery that's being shown there, or that he's interested in, rather than, say, the unhygienic conditions of cutting up meat in the South African sun in the street. There are many which show cultural and leisure activities, gambling, music, dance, and there is even a series that might best be described as about male grooming. Moreover, Heseltine was not only drawn not only to the activities of the people he photographs, but also to the quality and the texture of the spaces they inhabited and the clothes they wore. Indeed, I would argue that at one level this is what he's photographing. So he attended closely to the pattern construction of the corrugated dwellings, their interior decoration with diverse packaging material. Such images resonate with the more recent colour work of Zueletu Matetwa, if people know that, even if one can also see Walker Evans, perhaps. So Heseltine's skilled use of a medium and occasionally large format camera enabled him to describe in enormous detail the clothes worn by his subjects, to show the pattern of a dress, or how a safety pin has been used to hold together a threadbare blouse. There is a degree of care here that is unusual, and the photographs are about far more than showing desperate housing and sanitary conditions, which is the sort of social context in which they had been presented, though indeed they were desperate. As I've indicated, the collection presents two distinct research challenges. The first is to reconstruct the biography of the photographs, to understand the social and historical context in which they were first made and shown, and, as we'll come on to, the significance of their subsequent travels from South Africa to England in the 1950s. But rather than expand on that here, I want to open a question about the meanings that might be generated by displaying the photographs to 21st century audiences, and perhaps most importantly, returning the photographs to the place where they were made, or rather to the place that is now become. Exploiting the capacity of photography to fold time back on itself, bringing the present face to face with the past. This second challenge is to understand what it means for South African and also British audiences to look at the photographs now in the post-apartheid era. This is a challenge for which no amount of archival research can help. It means paying attention to the photographs as images, and it's probably worth noting that my kind of work with this collection has largely been with a collection of negatives. There were 25 extant prints from a Cape Town exhibition. But the fact that I've been working with a body of negatives means that my experience of the images has mostly, or in my initial experience of the images, has mostly been on screen as scans, as negatives that have been scanned. And I think that kind of way pushes you to think about them as images rather than necessarily as kind of material objects. So paying attention to them as images and to the various ways they might be presented to contemporary audiences, and raising the question of whether the photographs can be redeemed from their troubled past, and the display provides sites for the exercise of new kinds of agency. There are, of course, multiple audiences to whom the images may be addressed, but in the time I've got available, I want to just say a few words about the exhibition of Heseltine's work we put on in Oxford in 2011-12, in other words, for a largely British audience, and then to reflect on bringing the work back to South African audiences, which is sort of something of a work in progress. Well, that's the small catalogue we did for the Oxford exhibition. And this is what they call the Long Gallery in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Just sort of a note, the woman in the middle, the elderly woman in the middle is the photographer's widow. I actually missed the photographer by about 18 months. He died about 18 months before I came across the collection. Woman on the right is the photographer's daughter I've been mainly talking to, and the guy gesturing is the person who did all the scans for me, and I think he's getting rather animated about the quality of the images there, as he did on a number of occasions. In shaping the exhibition at the Pitt Rivers, I had two main aims. First, to showcase what by any standards I think are some exceptionally powerful visual images, particularly the portraits. And this collection, whilst there might be a sort of initial sense of, oh, well, this is documentary work, actually by far the largest portion of the collection I think are what you could quite reasonably call portraits, even though these people are not named, so it's problematic in some senses. I've thrown this one in because I thought it might connect with Brendan's paper yesterday. So the exhibition was to some extent a celebration of the photographic accomplishment of the photographer, though it was important that this was moderated by a sense of the political and historical realities from which the images emerged. In both this exhibition and the selection I made for the book, I decided to maintain the integrity of the different areas of the city that I kind of pointed out to you, displaying images together that came from the same location. One could easily make a thematic selection, and I did play with some possibilities in that regard, But spatial segregation was so central to apartheid South Africa that in the end, even with the considerable distance of time and the demise of the racist apartheid state, I felt uncomfortable presenting the images in this way. The politics of space continue to be of immense importance in South Africa, and that continuity needed acknowledging. I mean, the spatial zoning, racial zoning, is not something that is easily unpicked or will be. It'll be a long story. Second aim was to tell the story of the mobility of the images. As I said, the kind of circulation, the networks within which the work began to circulate. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but in short, having appeared in an exhibition which was ostensibly about poor housing conditions in Cape Town in 1952, the work travelled with the photographer to England, and through some kind of sort of chance connections really, was subsequently exhibited in London in 1955 as part of the emerging church-based opposition to the apartheid policies being pursued by the South African government. So to some extent it was chance that they happened to be shown as part of the emerging anti-apartheid movement in London, but actually those were kind of networks that were beginning to form, and I mean, there's at one level you could say actually there was possibly the first anti-apartheid photographic exhibition to take place in London, and there would be many more. So it was kind of beginning to kind of work out some of those networks of circulation. Two things I want to note. First, Heseltine did not pursue the exhibition opportunities himself. Rather, his work was picked up and used by others, becoming part of these larger networks through which images circulated internationally. Second, there is some ideological distance between the Cape Town exhibition and the London exhibition. So clearly the meaning of the images was perceived as sufficiently malleable to meet these different purposes. Telling the story of the mobility of the images was particularly important to the Oxford exhibition because Pitt Rivers, if you don't know, is a museum of anthropology, and I wanted visitors to have some sense of this interconnectedness between British and South African histories that these photographs both represented but also sustained. I think there were, it's the two things going on there. Two further things I want to comment on. The collection also contains a number of images that might unsettle a politically progressive reading. Heseltine was not political in any real sense. Specifically those Heseltine made at something called the Van Riebeeck Festival of 1952. The Van Riebeeck Festival was a celebration of 300 years of white settlement in South Africa, and could only conceive of black South Africans in terms that were essentialising and, to put it bluntly, an insult to most urban black South Africans. These images, I felt, in the Oxford exhibition needed handling with caution, and it's no accident that they're the smallest images in the exhibition with the longest caption. This was a deliberate and considered attempt to counter the representational power of the state in these visual performances, which is what was going on in those images, which passes on to us through Heseltine's photographs. In other words, to undermine their artistic agency, lest it captivate the viewer. Of course, it would be impossible to stop someone viewing the exhibition, coming to the bottom image, the image on your right here, and deciding they had now found the authentic Africa they expected to see. But I hope, in the way it's presented, at least I've made that reading a little less likely. The fact that one cannot entirely predict or control the way in which images are read is not to be regretted, of course. On the contrary, it's one of the very reasons to exhibit the work. It was intriguing, therefore, to receive a request last year by a young fine artist, Shakira Campbell, studying at the Ruskin School of Art in Oxford, asking to use an image from the exhibition in the performance piece she was proposing. In consultation with the photographer's family, we agreed to the use, and the performance took place at the old power station in Oxford. It consisted of the artist, who identified herself as black British, wearing a satin blindfold and standing facing the image, singing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." So this is the performance. This performance here, and this is the image she was using. The song resonates in a number of ways. It was composed in the deep south of the United States in the 19th century and associated with resistance to slavery. It was also picked up as an anthem by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Although the specific resonance perhaps with Heseltine there is a little strained, given that by the 1960s essentially his work had been forgotten, it does nevertheless echo those sort of multiple associations between the struggle of black South Africans and that of African Americans in the civil rights struggles. It has, of course, been appropriated as a popular rugby anthem, particularly by the English, but was also performed by the South African male choral group Ladysmith Black Mambazo, South African Rugby World Cup in 1995. And it was at that World Cup that Nelson Mandela sought to reinvest the sport of rugby, historically associated with whites and widely regarded by blacks as a symbol of the oppressor, with a more inclusive sense of South African nationhood, by allowing the hosting of the event to go ahead in the first place, and in the second year of his presidency, donning a Springboks shirt when he appeared at the final. The final video, this is a video piece. I haven't got the video here to show, but it sort of runs for about 2 minutes. The final video of the performance has a melancholy quality to it, perhaps suggesting something of the loneliness of the archival resting place of these portraits in comparison to the collective identities to which the song alludes. Although, as I've indicated already, the final home of the negatives is yet to be resolved. Nevertheless, whatever assessment one arrives at of the artwork, it's interesting to see Heseltine's photographs being reappropriated in the present in the ways I hadn't anticipated. Taking the photographs back to South Africa is a work in progress. In March 2011, I was fortunate enough to be able to travel to South Africa to talk about, more importantly to show, the images to several groups, including some photography students, and also to some ex-residents of District 6 as part of the Human Rights Day programme held at District 6 Museum. This is, the image on the left is District 6, a large, they're only just beginning to rebuild on District 6. It was an area that was kept blank for a long period. And the image on the right is one of these ex-residents getting very animated about some of the pictures. It was interesting, but a majority of the discussion we had around the pictures was about where they were, what street this was, and there were quite animated arguments between some of these elderly residents, former residents, about whether that was that street or the other street, which is, I think, interesting actually. That the importance of locating the work in their memory and experience is crucial. So this engagement has begun, albeit partially, a process of reconnection and naming, the identification of places and streets, underscoring the ongoing importance of place that I referred to earlier, even if it's not been possible to identify any of the characters that Heseltine photographed. And that, some of these people may still be alive, some of the younger people in the images. But given the kinds of dispersal that the forced removals affected, it's very much more difficult. There is no community except in memory to go back to with this work, in the way some of the work around repatriation of photographic images in, say, with sort of First Nation communities in Canada does have a sort of centre to which they can at least begin to make those kind of connections. A few of the images called forth stories, such as this one called forth the story of a memory of a ferocious cat called Zorro that used to menace the residents of Bloemhof Flats. In a way that arguably supports what I said earlier about Heseltine's way of looking, the students that I showed the work to found many of the images a source of considerable amusement, largely on account of the dress styles of earlier generations. There was little response on the social conditions documented in the images. One might speculate that that's because one could actually go and find very similar conditions today and photograph them, and some of these students do. So that bit was not kind of so relevant to them, or they didn't feel it was so relevant. In general, many of the photography students found the images enjoyable to look at and kind of hysterical in some cases. But you have to acknowledge that less positive readings of the work also remains possible. A seminar I gave a visiting scholar from another part of Africa regarded the images as part of a darkest Africa paradigm, and I'm obviously conscious that Heseltine can be perceived as yet another white photographer documenting black subjects. So I wouldn't wish to trivialise such comments. The very serious inequalities of power going on here. But my concern is, in a sense, sometimes the images become superfluous to that kind of discussion. And what I'm interested in exploring is whether or not those arguments could withstand looking at the images, and whether in contemporary South Africa it's possible to undertake a project of looking at those images with contemporary South Africans. So that's a kind of research question, if you like. Clearly, there's much more work to be done to bring these images to contemporary South African audiences and to understand the ways in which they can be meaningful there. I'm currently working to organise an exhibition in Cape Town, which would give an opportunity for some sort of more sustained local engagement. I want here just to offer some tentative thoughts on why it might be important to pursue such a goal. Heseltine's photographs I want to propose are more than simply of historical interest. Compared with many photographs from the apartheid period, I would like to argue that they're unusually open to the present. Jacob Dlamini, a South African writer, has recently sought to understand the phenomena he calls native nostalgia. That is, the capacity of many black South Africans, including himself, to remember their lives under apartheid with fondness. At the heart of his argument is a paradox. At the same time as refusing the categorical disjunction apartheid sought to impose on the idea and the reality of the urban African, it is its very spatial instantiation, the township, that is and must be embraced, for it was there that urban black identities were and still are formed and black lives played out. What Dlamini would also have us realise, however, is that the township was not this tightly bounded space that apartheid planners imagined, but also a point of connection to multiple elsewheres, local, national and international. The lines of thought Dlamini sets out here I suggest, be discerned in Heseltine's photographs and the story of their mobility. Heseltine's aesthetic sensibility, his interest in the diverse styles and self-fashioning of Cape Town's inhabitants, and the skill and care with which he rendered them in visual form resonates with the work of contemporary South African photographers such as Zwelethwa Mthethwa, Zanele Maholi and Lola Vallejo. At the same time as they foreshadow the traumatic dislocations that apartheid forced removals visited on many South African communities, the legacies of which persist into the present, Heseltine's photographs lend themselves to the imagination of a more cosmopolitan urbanism. Perhaps then these photographs can provide a site of dialogue about the past and a space for imagination in the present. I want to end the paper with a juxtaposition. One of Heseltine's images made, I believe, in the Borkap area of the city is intriguingly, or strikes me as intriguingly similar to the South African photographer Zanele Maholi's 2006 photograph titled Martin Machapa. Juxtaposition both prompts and condenses the questions with which I've been grappling in this paper and in thinking about the place of the Heseltine collection in South Africa's photographic present. In what ways does Heseltine's work speak to contemporary South African photography, or can it speak to South African photography? Is it possible to reinsert Heseltine's work back into the present? And what is at stake in attempting to do so? The juxtaposition has acquired an added poignancy as a result of events last year. As the rediscovery of Heseltine's photographs has enriched the archive of South African photography, so there are losses too. In April 2012, a break-in at Zanele Maholi's flat resulted in the theft of 20 external hard drives, representing a substantial and in some cases irreplaceable collection of her work produced between 2008 and 2012. That this material appeared to be the burglar's main object has generated considerable speculation that this was no random crime, but an attempt to remove and destroy a body of work that, controversially for some political elements in South Africa, affirms lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender identities. Despite the end of apartheid, it seems, it's clear that image making in South Africa can still be a hazardous occupation. And I'll end there. Thank you.